Latin America just closed a cycle of 5 years with very important growth rates over 5%. Reserves stand at over $450 billion, and poverty rates were reduced from 44 to 35%. Yes, Latin American economies have been performing well, but the enormous social challenges it is confronting demand continuous efforts to make growth more inclusive. With highly qualified participants from over 44 countries, such gathering turns the World Economic Forum on Latin America exceedingly relevant and remarkably unique. 550 business, public, and civil society leaders will evaluate together trends and changes in the global economy, in the political scenario, in investment and trade relationships between Asia and Latin America, as well as on innovation in business and social affairs. The agenda includes a regional overview of business and political strategies in 5 spheres: geopolitics, competitiveness, energy, growth with income distribution, and finally, innovation that includes security, climate change, and the preservation of biodiversity. The World Economic Forum meeting in Mexico aims to support regional leaders to share perceptions and seek common solutions to their multiple challenges. Among these is that of promoting the face of the modern Latin America, showing the best of its creative culture, its entrepreneurs, its economic performance, and its conquest in social issues and in the preservation of its natural riches. By tomorrow, you will decide what urgent decisions are to be made in the next 20 months to respond to this financial turmoil and design proactive strategies to ensure economic sustainability for the region. On behalf of the foundation of the World Economic Forum, we're in debt to the government of Mexico for their very generous support, and especially to President Felipe Calderón, who made this unique gathering possible. Such recognition is also extended to our co-chairs, Sergio Gabrieli, Alejandro Balleres, Sam Di Piazza, José Antonio Fernández Carvajal, Guo Shukin, and Bill Rhodes, as well as speakers, moderators, and the talented professionals who made this summit possible. Being a Mexican, it is with great pride that I welcome you to this 3rd World Economic Forum on Latin America, and I wish you a very fruitful meeting. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Emilio, for this opening remarks, and welcome to all of you in this meeting of the first plenary session of this forum, which has a very important subject matter and a very important number of panelists, and I thank all of you for being here. As you know, the issue we deal with in this meeting is the 2008 political landscape in the Americas, and I stress the Americas because from the composition of the panel and the questions that are placed before the speakers, it is very clear that the intention of the organizers is to deal with hemispheric relations, not to have a new discussion on what's going on in Latin America, which I'm certain that our panelists will also address, but more what are the big issues for the whole hemisphere, what are the hemispheric issues. This is very relevant, I should say, from the point of view of the Organization of American States, because we are having next year, we hope in April, our Summit of the Americas. Actually, I'm sure that Prime Minister Patrick Manning from Trinidad and Tobago, who is attending this meeting, will be speaking about that, because the meeting is going to be held in Trinidad and Tobago, and it's going to happen a few months only after the inauguration of a new president of the United States. So the whole issue of hemispheric relations is very much in the forefront, and there is, as you say, a lot of talk about the fact that the U.S. is probably doing little in Latin America. They're not addressing the proper issues, etc. I think that's not. Let me tell you, from the outset, I myself don't share very much that view. But it's very clear that we have an open agenda, and many of the issues are there to be discussed, and we don't have too much consensus about them. And there has been discussions this year on migration. There have been discussions on the issues of crime. There have been discussions on energy. There have been discussions on very recently on trade. The recent events in the U.S. Congress all show us that this issue, in which we have some kind of a consensus for the past years, is not as that consensus doesn't exist as it did before. I am going to therefore open the floor to open the first round with a very relevant panel. We are going to be speaking in English or in Spanish, whatever you want. Anyway, if you want to recognize the Americans, they are the ones wearing the suits. And our first speaker has to do a lot with what's going on in Latin America today. He's a very relevant public servant. He has been a protagonist of the enormous and positive work that the government of President Álvaro Uribe is doing in Colombia. He's also a very relevant protagonist from another point of view. As you know, Fernando Araujo, the foreign minister of Colombia, was himself a prisoner of the FARC for over 6 years, and he managed to escape, giving therefore an enormous image of courage and of the big tragedy of the hostages in Colombia. And as a foreign minister, has been very active in developing the policies that have made Colombia successful from the point of view not only of the internal situation, but also of its international position. And I'm sure that he's going to be able to talk to us about the trade issues, the war issues, the conflict issues, the peace effort, etc., and all the agenda that we have to deal with in the Americas in this 2008. So my first speaker is Fernando Araujo, dear friend and the Foreign Minister of Colombia.
Muchas gracias, José Miguel. Un saludo muy cordial para todos los participantes en este foro mundial. Igual, un saludo muy especial a los compañeros de este panel. Y hago una primera presentación en esta primera ronda, hablando un poco sobre los retos que tenemos en este momento en Colombia como parte de todo este proceso americano o latinoamericano tan dinámico que estamos viviendo en este momento, y conscientes, como somos en Colombia, de la interrelación que existe entre todos los países y cómo la forma en que cada país vaya resolviendo su propia agenda va a contribuir a la solución de los problemas de toda América Latina y a fortalecer.
And it will also strengthen the processes of integration that today are a clear imperative in Latin America. And maybe the biggest challenge we're facing is to integrate among ourselves by means of constructive processes, despite the differences that might exist from an ideological or from an economic models standpoint, because some governments stress certain elements more than others. As Colombia sees it, the main challenges that we are facing now are three. Number one, to expand security so it will cover all Colombians. Security with democracy as described, implemented, and defended by President Uribe. This means security for all Colombians in all regions of the country, regardless of the various political causes we may be espousing. And this policy has been very successful in Colombia, and as a result of it, after 5 years of practicing this security policy actively, the government has been able to reduce all crime rate numbers in Colombia, rates that have to do with kidnapping, murders, thefts, and any other type of crime. Now, if we spread the concept of security we're doing something that is very necessary for all governments in Latin America to do. Now, in some cases, there may be different degrees. In the case of Colombia, stressing security has a lot to do with a struggle that has to include us all against drug trafficking, which is the main source of resources for all violent groups, and also in the face of terrorist groups that are affecting Colombian society. So security in Colombia is very closely related with drug trafficking and terrorism. Now, when it comes to Latin America as a whole, it's very important for the governments, all governments, to understand the size of this problem and for all of us to work together to solve these problems. We must understand that these groups will not give up their violent methods unless they're forced to do so. In other words, the solution is not a solution that can be obtained because of the goodwill of the actors, but rather by firmly exercising actions that will force them to stop acting as criminals. And the second topic that is key to our development is to strengthen investments. Strengthening investments will happen as we spread investment opportunities and as we provide security, legal security for these investments, and as long as the investments meet three requirements of social responsibility of investments vis-à-vis the state, with transparent relationship between investors and the state, number one, in their participation in the bids, payment of taxes, and carrying out all legal requirements. Secondly, there's a matter of social responsibility vis-à-vis workers, the relationship between investors and their employees, their workers, and full recognition of all of the labor guarantees that may apply, and social responsibility of the investors with the environment, which is also something that affects all of us. There's a matter of responsibility to the environment. And the third element, which is also key for the development of all of our countries, and specifically in Colombia, is to meet the need to meet social needs of all of our fellow citizens. In the case of Colombia, the government is committed to meet the MDG objectives as soon as possible, to meet the real needs of our people, and especially to fight against poverty that's been so harmful. This is an introduction to the way we look at Latin American reality from Colombia and the internal problems in Colombia. Thank you.
I should have said from the outset that we were agreed that we will 3 or 4 minutes in the first round, and I'm sorry I didn't do that. And I think that the minister has raised three very relevant issues. The issue, of course, of peace in the region, the issue of war and the drug traffic and terrorism are certainly very relevant, and certainly very relevant in Colombia particularly, but they are elsewhere also. And then in growth and investment, and the whole issue of poverty and social justice, which has so much affected our nations recently. Now, nobody has, I would say, followed more consistently the agenda of hemispheric relations in the past years than Peter Hakim and the Inter-American Dialogue. He has been persistent in pointing out the need to have an agenda first and to deal collectively with all our problems. He has always been a very good critic, whoever is presenting the issues. So I'm sure that you won't fail us now, Peter, so give us your critical view of the issues of the agenda.
Thank you, Jose Miguel. Let me say, I think there's one more difference between the Latin Americans and the Americans. If I sort of understood the introductions and read the materials for this, Latin Americans don't like to hear good news. They sort of, they tend to react negatively to it. And, you know, as Jose Miguel said, I've been working on Latin America, involved with Latin America for a long time, longer than I care to remember. And, you know, this is really, over the past 5, 6 years, this has been the best period in Latin American history that I can remember personally, in terms of economic progress, in terms of the democracy across the region, the expectations of democracy, the peace. I mean, you know, we worried about war a couple of weeks ago, but the fact is most of the region is at peace now. It's one of the few regions of the world. And, you know, there are immense problems, and I'm the first one to make long lists of the problems, crime and violence, the social issues, but even the social issues of progress is being made on. I think we should start off recognizing some good news. And if there's a big complaint and, you know, it turns on the quality of U.S. relations with Latin America, U.S. policy, this is the complaint one hears. But let me say, you know, if I'm asked, and I'm not sure I'm going to be asked, to give advice to the next president of the United States, you know, my advice to him would be to stick with the substantive agenda of the Bush administration. In other words, if you look at that agenda when I say stick to it, what do I mean? In other words, continue to press hard to get the Colombia Free Trade Agreement and the Panama Free Trade Agreement passed by Congress and put into force. Maintain the trade preferences with those countries that are not interested in negotiating free trade agreements with the United States. What else? I'd like to see a comprehensive immigration reform in the United States. Terribly important for most countries in Latin America. Who was the strongest advocate of that was President Bush, and stymied by Congress. And similarly, one would hope the U.S. would continue to cooperate on security matters with Colombia, and indeed would really move forward on security cooperation with Mexico as well. And I can go on to other areas too, that I think that the substantive agenda is pretty good that the United States has. If there's one big change, and with this I'll stop, it's that the U.S. ought to be changing its policy toward Cuba. After 50 years, it's time, I think, for the U.S. to begin to recognize that continued pressure and isolation, embargo are not going to work, and that there really does need to be some change there. But in any event, Jose Miguel, I hope we can all recognize some good news.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much. And on the other side now, on the side of the Latin Americans, I'm sure that few have done more to present some of the big problems and the big issues than Moises Naim, who, as you know, has been for some years now the editor of Foreign Policies, the second most, one of the two, I'm sorry, I didn't say second, one of the two most important reviews on international relations. He is the author of several books. His recent book, Illicit, showed from the outset, for the first time, how serious the issue of crime and international crime has become for the world in general, but also for the Americans themselves. And I think that he is also in a good position, therefore, to talk about that, another issue for our agenda. So, Moises, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Secretary General Insulza. Thank you for the generous comments. Peter Hakim specializes in good news, and I want to stress instead surprises. I want to just very briefly talk about two surprises that we have already witnessed and one surprise that I will predict. The two surprises are, the first one is how good the economy has been in Latin America and how bad the politics have been. There is a paradox in which, as Emilio Lozoya rightly pointed out, Latin America is coming through the four best years since 1492. Since the first time that statistics were collected, Latin America has not had such a fast growth, and especially such fast growth in income per capita, such lifting of people out of poverty. Jose Miguel Insulza the other day was telling us that when he started as Secretary General of the OAS, he used to talk about the 200 million people in poverty in Latin America. Now he starts his speeches talking about the 170 million people. And so there is an emerging middle class. There is a variety of, there has been a tsunami of good news in the economic front in Latin America. And yet, in the same period when we have had this great economic news, we have seen a lot of political conflict, internal political conflict in the region emerge. And new forms of politics that are, besides and trying to bypass political parties, groups that block the streets and the communications, and as a new form of doing politics that generates a very strange dynamic at the same time in which the economics were going that well. So if those of you that feel that perhaps the future of Latin America's economies are going to go into some slowdown, then this surprise generates some perplexity. Because if the politics are bad when the economics are good, what happens to the politics when the economics are bad? So that's the first surprise. The second surprise is that in recent years, for a long period, the main international issue in Latin America has been its relationship with the United States. Countries define their international relations and their standing in the world in Latin America by the way they related to the United States. Well, the surprise is that in the last few years, the central theme has not been relationship between Latin America and the United States, but intra-Latin America. And so the relationship between the countries inside the region has become very important. And now we face a Latin America of blocs in a way that we have not seen before, and with deep divisions. We have seen all sorts of coalitions and all sorts of highly complicated interactions and frictions that are also have acquired a very potent dimension, and that will define a lot of what's going to happen going forward. And finally, my third point is the surprise that I will predict. And that is that the next president of the United States, whomever that is going to face the highest level of global goodwill since 2001. In September 12, 2001, the day after the terrorist attack, Le Monde, the French newspaper, titled, the main title was "Nous sommes tous Américains." We are all Americans. And it echoed a sentiment that was around the world in which the United States was supported. There was sympathy, there was solidarity, there was indignation about what had happened. And so that level of sympathy and support and solidarity and goodwill towards the United States did not last long. Policy decisions in Washington and the different ways in which, you know the story and the reasons, but the attitudes towards the United States declined sharply around the world, in Europe and in Asia and in Latin America and so on. Well, I predict that the next president, the world is hungry for a different United States. The world is hungry for a United States that plays a different role, not the role of invading countries, preemptive invasions, unilateral bullying of allies and all that, but a United States that works together with other countries. That I predict is going to happen, and there opens interesting opportunities for Latin America too. Thank you, Jose Miguel.
Thank you, Moises. Well, I think that we have touched on several issues, probably not that much about trade issues. And I very much recall when I was a foreign minister of Chile, I went practically every few months to the U.S. Congress to ask about the fast track on the negotiations with free trade agreement with Chile. And I always had very good conversations and some very supportive words from the chairman of Ways and Means at that time, which was Jim Colby. And I would like to comment, if possible, on the issue of trade, what's going on, what happened with the country that was the biggest promoter of free trade. Can that change, and how will that affect the relations between the U.S. and Latin America?
Well, thank you. I was all set to tick off, since you said to talk about four or five things that were for the region as a whole.
You can do that.
No. I will change, because getting into trade is kind of the thing I like to talk about anyhow. And it's certainly very much on the minds, I think, of everybody here and in the United States and those that are policymakers here. So let me just talk a little bit about trade in these elections in the United States. No matter what, as Moises just said, there's going to be a great well of goodwill for the next president of the United States, because this president has squandered a lot of that. And I think that's very true. But whatever we think of this president, there's been no doubt that on the trade front, he has had a very aggressive agenda, and he's moved very steadily on that front to try to bring about trade agreements and around the world, and multilaterally to keep the Doha round on track. What we're seeing right now, I think, in the run-up to the election here, is something that's it's dismaying to those of us who are free traders, and that is an effort by the two Democratic candidates to kind of outdo each other on this subject and say, I'm more against trade agreements than you are. I'm more against what NAFTA did than you are. Your husband brought NAFTA into being. I never would have done that, and so on, back and forth they go with this. And the problem with that is, while it may be rhetoric for a campaign, it's very difficult to get out from that after an election. And what we're seeing is something that's really quite breathtaking, actually. This is a president in the United States right now that has been accused of being unilateralist and acting in a unilateral fashion. But nothing that he has done that I can think of in his tenure as president is as unilateral as what the two Democratic candidates for president have suggested, and that is unilaterally abrogating the NAFTA agreement if they can't get a major renegotiation of it with Mexico and Canada. That is just an extraordinary, I think, statement, and undermines, I think, will undermine our credibility on trade. Then, of course, we have the second thing here that the Congress did just the other day by essentially changing the terms of the debate by saying, even though we have a trade promotion authority, what we used to call fast track, that guarantees a vote on trade once the trade agreement is done and submitted to Congress, well, that may be what the law says, but we're the arbiters of our own rules here in Congress, and we will change the rule to say that the bill does not have to be brought to the floor. And indeed, it is technically within the rights of Congress to change those rules, but it certainly undermines the spirit, I think, of the legislation. And what I think is so devastating about that vote is not so much what it means for the Colombia trade agreement. In fact, I'll have a little bit of good news here, and I think we will get the Colombia trade agreement here. But what it does is it undermines any attempt in the future to have trade promotion authority for the President of the United States. Why would any Secretary of State, why would any member of Congress, why would any trade association, why would any other country, why would any lobbyist want to enter into a tough fight over getting trade promotion authority for the President? And the last time we did it, it passed by one vote. Why would anybody want to enter into that rigorous fight, knowing that at the end, the Congress could just change it anyhow and it wouldn't mean a thing? So I think it's going to make it very difficult for us to get back on track trade negotiations in the future. There's some more to say about all of this, and I'm sure we'll have some as the discussion goes along. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And I talked about two major foreign policy magazines, and the second one is Foreign Affairs. And Rafael Fernández de Castro has been, as you know, the editor of Foreign Affairs in Spanish for several years. A teacher, a very relevant scholar at the ITAM in Mexico City. And maybe he can say, how does it look from that side, from the Mexican side? I mean, most of these agenda issues have a lot to do with Mexico, so how about it?
Yeah, let me say something, thank you, Jose Miguel, about, how will Mexicans vote if they could vote in the U.S. election? And I wish I could take an opinion poll here and listen to you. How would you vote in the coming U.S. election? That I believe is very important for Latin America and for the world, not to say for the U.S. But let me share with you that this Mexico City newspaper, Reforma, published this opinion poll last week, and the Mexican preferences on the U.S. elections are as follow. Mexicans were mostly now Democrats. Hillary and Barack Obama, they leading among Mexicans. Hillary has 30% approval, Barack has 28%, almost they tied, and then in a distant third place is John McCain with 7%. So I was surprised because it seems to me that the only candidate which is right in the two issues that affect the most Mexico, which are trade issues and immigration issues, he's the only one, McCain, who is right on those two issues. And so why is, I will say, that the Democrats are so popular in Mexico, or the other way around, the Republican is so unpopular in Mexico? I will argue that the number one issue affecting U.S.-Latin American relations nowadays is the war on Iraq. Seems to me that is the reason why most of Latin Americans, I will put it that way, are for a Democratic candidate. And there's also, I guess, this historical affinity between Latin Americans and Democrats, but still now very much is the war on Iraq. Seems to me that the war on Iraq has fed these nationalistic feelings in Latin America, these anti-American feelings, and it has really made the day of these populists like, let's name him Hugo Chavez. He has truly profited from this environment in which Washington is very unpopular in Latin America. So, beyond the rhetoric, seems to me that the war has weakened the U.S., at least strategically, economically, and in its moral leadership in world affairs. So to me, that's the number one issue. The second, what about trade and NAFTA? Seems to me that Mexican public opinion is dead drunk, to put it that way. Why so? Because, well, the Democrats, they bash in NAFTA, they pandering on trade issues, and if we take Hillary and Barack Obama at the war, they will renegotiate NAFTA, which means they will kill NAFTA. I'm pretty sure that the U.S. Congress will not vote for NAFTA again, and I can assure you that the Mexican Congress will never approve in the future NAFTA. So, that's concerning for Mexicans, and I will say in general for Latin Americans, all this pandering of the Democrats on trade issues. Let me say something about immigration to close my remarks. Immigration does not explain the difference between why the preference of the Mexicans for the Democrats? I will say not only Hillary and Barack, but also McCain, they pro-immigrant, they pro-immigration reform. The good news about the primary season is that in the end, the primary season ended up being very positive for the immigration debate. Why so? It's very simple, because of the Latino vote. This year, as the coming U.S. election, there's a potential of 10 million Latino votes, and that really explains why after the first two stops, Iowa and New Hampshire, immediately all the candidates become very positive in their attitudes, in their rhetoric towards immigration. So that is important to bear in mind. It's interesting to note also how all the anti-immigration candidates, they went nowhere. Tom Tancredo not even made it to Iowa, which was very positive for the anti-immigration climate in the U.S. Let me close, Jose Miguel, by saying that there's immigration is an open issue in U.S. Latin American relations, but especially an open issue for Northern Latin America. It is very important for Mexico, for Central America, and for the Caribbean, and a little bit so for the Andean region. And why is an open issue, it's a pending issue, I will say, because there's about 9 million Latin Americans living in the U.S. without proper documentation. That means that there's almost 9 million Latin Americans and counting living in fear nowadays. Why so? Because, well, they might be deported to Mexico, to El Salvador, to Guatemala, and most of them are living in mixed families. That means that they have a legal son, a legal daughter, and will be very complicated for them if they have to come back to their origin country. So this is a pending issue, and we will see which one of the three leading U.S. Candidates could do something for immigration. The one that so far has been more consistent on immigration issues, I will say, on the record is Barack Obama, but the only one who has really shown, that he will push for an immigration reform is McCain, because he already did so as a U.S. Senator. I will stop here.
Well, thank you very much, and of course our last speaker is probably who we have all been waiting for, which is the man in charge of U.S. policy towards Latin America and the Caribbean. I must say that it's rare, even in a country like the U.S., in which many people have dedicated their lives to the study and to work with Latin America. Many have relations there. It is still not rare to find somebody with the degree of knowledge and of understanding of the region as Tom Shannon has. Tom has been for these past years actually the person in charge of U.S. policy towards the region, which of course is a much more collective exercise, but he has been the most visible face in that. And he has given always a sense of some essential certainties and good understanding, accepting the points of view of several people, projecting an image that allows us for a very, I would say, very reasonable relation, in spite of the fact that so many problems have occurred. So I think that it's fit that we hear what he has to say about this whole issue of hemispheric relations and how big the changes might be with the new government.
Well, thank you very much, Jose Miguel. It's great to be here. And one of the advantages and disadvantages of speaking last is that most of what I'd hoped to say has already been said in some fashion or another. I would like to associate myself with Peter Haycom. I'm an optimist. I believe that this is a region that has gone through really dynamic change over the past bunch of years, but that in the balance, the change, both political, social, and economic, has been positive. This is not to mean that there aren't challenges. The point isn't to be Pollyannish. I think the point is to see the region clearly, but as we see it, this is a region which really has made a tremendous transition to democracy, a transition to free markets, a transition to economic integration, and a transition to connecting in an increasingly globalized world. It now has to kind of deepen these connections, deepen these commitments, and really kind of make a strategic leap to accomplishment, and to show that democracy can deliver the goods, that free markets can deliver the goods. But I think even with the surprises that the region has faced, and even with the surprise that might come, as Moises has noted, I think we're really at a unique and important point in hemispheric relations, because as countries have democratized, as they've globalized, as they've opened their markets, they really have unleashed social forces and created new interest bases in their societies that are causing these countries and these governments to redefine their national interests. And as they redefine their national interests, they're bumping up against each other. And this is what we're seeing in the region today, especially more broadly in hemispheric relations, but also within South America, as Moises noted. We're seeing countries trying to understand what their new national interests are, how they communicate these interests in a multilateral environment, and how they do it in a way that's in their interest but doesn't provoke larger ruptures in the Americas. And I think that we're at a point in time in which the success of this broader effort will really depend on leadership. And by leadership, I mean not only political leadership, but also social and economic leadership. And so many of you are part of this leadership cadre. In other words, the responsibility and the challenge falls not only to presidents and foreign ministers, but it falls to all of you. And I would really urge that this is the moment to engage, and to engage in a positive way in this process. And as I say this, and as I look at the challenges facing hemispheric relations right now, I would argue that in some ways the biggest challenge is a challenge we face, which is the ability to stay engaged in the Americas, and to maintain continuity in our engagement, and to make sure that how we engage is sustainable over time. Because what has struck me over the years that I've been working on the region is that because of the democratization, because of the opening of markets, and because of the globalization, Latin American countries today have options and opportunities and alternatives that they did not have in the past. We are no longer the sole important player in the region. We operate in a much more competitive environment. There are other alternatives out there. And this is why the points made by Jim Colby are so important. The Colombia Free Trade Agreement is about the United States making a commitment to Latin America. It's more than a commitment to Colombia. It's a commitment to free trade. It's a commitment to a vision of economic engagement. It's a commitment to political values. It's a commitment to dispute resolution. And it is a commitment that we will be present, that we will connect our economies and our political vision to the region. And it is in our interest to do this, because if we step aside, Latin America will not wait for us. Latin America has a clear understanding of what needs to get done. It might not always accomplish it in the cleanest, neatest way, but it is moving forward, and I believe it will continue to move forward, and this is one of the reasons why we need to be present. And let me close by saying that my own view is that Latin America will miss George Bush. I think they have had in President Bush a partner who has not only committed himself and his resources in a way that no other modern president has since John Kennedy, but has also fundamentally understood the changes taking place, and fundamentally understood that this is about opening up societies and opening up economies so the poorest and most vulnerable members of those economies have access to power, both economic, political, and also social. And I believe that he has rebuilt a structure of engagement with the region, and it's our hope. And he's done so in a bipartisan way. It's really with the Colombia Free Trade Agreement that we hit our first difficult partisan moment in a long time. And it is my hope that whoever is elected, whoever assumes office on January 20th, 2009, will understand what he or she is being given, and will make sure that the engagement in the hemisphere is continuous and sustainable.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, and thank you all for this very important presentation. So, well, there are a lot of questions and a lot of issues that we would like to cover. I mean, I would like to, for example, to ask if anyone wants to comment about this assertion, which is, I would say, very bold, by Rafael Fernandez de Castro, who says, look, I mean, there's nothing to do with the issues. They just don't like the war, and that's why they are very much against U.S. policy and against the candidate who, in fact, has promoted a different immigration policy and who is much in favor of free trade. I think that, but I will leave it to you to comment. And another issue I would like to, everybody talks about, or subliminals, at least underlies the fact, Minister Araujo was the one who said it most in a more positive way, I would say. There are ideological differences. We want to overcome them and work together, but there are ideological differences. I would say there's a common situation in which the role of the state is back in Latin American politics, and everybody talks about a new role for the state, etc. But at the same time, we must admit that there are some, on that basis, there are several ideological differences. Is it possible to live all together and to work all together in the Americas and go forward with integration? I think that's also a very relevant question. There are some very important issues that have been placed here today, and I wish that you can just take 2 minutes or in some order to say whatever you want about these or any other issues. Moises, do you want to begin?
I agree that when I mentioned that the region is divided now in blocks, there is no doubt that geography has something to do with that. And as you said, Jose Miguel, there is ideology and different perspectives. But there is also a power struggle here. And there are countries that are trying to develop their own ways of doing things without trying to impose their ways of doing things on others. And I'm thinking of Chile. Chile is the most successful development model in the world. Chile has achieved great growth in a democracy, has shown the world how to take a resource-based economy and convert it into a value-added export base, and has done so in a context of democracy, freedom, respect for the rule of law, and so on. So we should be all applauding Chilenismo. Yet the debates in Latin America are about Chavismo. It's about Chavez, and Chavez is a proponent of ideas that have been tested. We know, Latin America and other regions in the world have tested already some of these proposals. And we know that they have created more poverty and more inequality and more corruption and more social regress. And yet that is what seems to get a lot of Latin Americans very enthusiastic. And contrary to the Chileans are not interested in exporting the models. You have not seen the Chileans trying to impose their views on others. But you have seen Venezuela and President Chavez using its oil money to try to build support around the region. And I think that's very important. And that probably has to do with ideology, but has a lot to do with power.
Thank you.
Let me say that I have two differences with Moises, and I'm glad that he's as far away from me as he is. Let me just say that in your opening remarks, Moises, you complained about the state of politics. You said the state of economics was the best it's been, but politics was among the worst, I think. And sure, there's political problems. One could make a huge, long laundry list of political problems. But I would like you to try and identify another period in Latin America in recent times where you've had 15, 16 elections in a row that have all been competitive, found to be free and fair, where there's been only one dispute over the result of the election. In other words, it's hard to find another time that the politics has been really better than it is now. Secondly, on the question of whether blocs are forming in the hemisphere. Frankly, Venezuela is a very disruptive country. It's a very sort of unpleasant neighbor. It's unpleasant to its own citizens. It's unpleasant to the rest of the hemisphere. But to talk about a bloc when Venezuela has been able to sort of get support from three of the weakest countries in Latin America, the most unstable, the ones that have had most difficulty to survive. The president survived from one election to the other in Bolivia, Ecuador, and Nicaragua. To call that a bloc seems to me a vast exaggeration. And Chavismo isn't debated all over the hemisphere. Go to Brazil. Chavismo isn't a big debate in Brazil. I mean, they're pursuing their own politics and economics. They're not arguing about Chavismo. In Chile, they're not arguing about Chavismo. In Mexico, they're not arguing about Chavismo. I think that it's just you're overblowing that and calling it blocks, and this is the central issue. It's not the central issue.
Can I briefly respond?
Let me give the floor to Rafael, and then I'll give it to you to respond.
Let me sit with Moises on this, Peter. And I would say, yes, Chavismo is a big issue in Latin America, in the hemisphere, and mostly because I don't see the Chileans out there. Yes, Moises, they're very successful, but I don't see President Bachelet being very aggressive on foreign policy or really having this competing position vis-a-vis Chavez in the hemisphere. That is a big problem of Chileans, and especially of yes, we're missing Ricardo Lagos in that sense. We're missing I would say, more hemispheric bold position of Mexico and Brazil. Yes, Brazil has a lot of global positions, but in the hemisphere, on very specific issues, I mean, it's nowhere to be seen. So that's why it seems to me there's a big vacuum out there, which is being fulfilled by Chavez, and yes, Chavismo is a big issue in Latin America.
You want to complement something?
Very, very quickly. First, to thank him for supporting.
Said he's sitting close to you, Moises.
Peter, very quickly. Elections are important, but be careful, because elections are necessary but not sufficient. And very often elections have not resolved problems but have created new problems. So measuring political stability or the level of conflictiveness by the fact that now Latin America can have elections is a very low standards. I think Latin Americans deserve better and more than measuring their progress just by the fact that they're not killing each other in terms of how to replace governments. So, yes, we have elections, and that's very good, but elections have not solved everything. Among other places where they have not solved a lot of things is here. We are in a country in which the Congress today cannot meet because a group that is not unlike some, that is very similar to some of the ideas that President Chavez exposes, doesn't allow the Congress of this country to meet. Why? Because they disagree with a law that has not even been passed. The government just proposed a law, and so there is a group in this country that just is using the new ways of politics, of blocking the streets and violence and everything else to impede. So if you don't call that political conflictiveness, what is that?
Yeah, Jim.
Well, I guess it must be the Latin American here, because I guess I come down more on the side of what I've been hearing over here than what Peter and Tom have been talking about here. But we could talk about the concerns. I could talk about some of the concerns that I have with Latin America. What I see is the possible drift away from the building of democratic institutions, which we've seen in certain countries here. The concern that all of us will have with the slowdown in the world economy, can we keep the economic growth going down here, with the concerns about inflation, the high prices of commodities, good for some countries but very bad for some other countries. Those are things of real concern. But I want to come back again to the United States domestically, and I want to pose this question to the audience and have you think about this, because I think it's a question that everybody here needs to be thinking about. How do we explain in this year of 2008, at a time when globalization has gone further than it ever has, when we have seen more people lifted out of poverty and brought into the middle class, when we have seen, at least until this very recent downturn, a very low unemployment rates, when we're seeing growth take place around the world, when we see virtually 100% of editorial writers and newspapers in the United States and throughout the world supporting the concept of trade, why are we seeing it slip away from us? And that's what's happening. The support for it is slipping away. I spend part of my time working for a think tank in Washington that does an annual survey of trade on both sides of the Atlantic, in Europe and the United States, a very extensive survey. And there's on both sides of the Atlantic, there's a clear decline in that support. And I think in other key parts of the world you would find the same thing. I find this difficult to explain, difficult to understand, and I think that somehow we are failing. We as opinion leaders, we as policymakers are failing to talk to the people of the opinion leaders and the public at large, not just in the United States but elsewhere in the world, to explain to them what the globalization is a reality, and what you have to do is we have to adjust to it, and we have to make sure that it works to benefit everybody. But we can't walk away from the aspects of it that are manifested in trade agreements.
Thank you very much. Do you want to...
¿Cómo no? Yo creo que desde el punto de vista de América Latina no hay un camino distinto a lograr la integración.
There's no other way but achieving integration. And we may have peaks and valleys during this process of integration, but ultimately all roads will lead to it. There are different economic blocks, I would call it, in order to distinguish the idea of bloc raised by Moises. There's Mercosur, the Andean community, These are what we call the Arc of the Pacific. These are countries that have the Pacific Ocean and that are looking towards Asia. But everything will end up converging because the successful models in the world are the integration models. The first successful model of integration is the United States, where there are 50 states that were able to build a common model. Then we have the European model, where through integration, they have been able to make impressive progress. It is only to the extent that we Latin Americans are able to create and bolster this integration process are we going to be successful. And this process of integration has to be based on shared values which exist, and what we need is to strengthen them, the values of democracy, of respect of institutions, of bolstering transparency and fighting corruption. To the extent that we're able to walk together along that track, we will be able to overcome the huge problems of the region, and which are the commitment of those of us who are in government.
Just very quickly, in terms of blocks, one block that has really not been perceived but was just noted by the foreign minister is that along the Pacific coast, stretching from Canada to the tip of Chile, there is an unbroken string of free trade agreements. And if our Congress finds fit to approve the Colombian and Panamanian free trade agreements, this unbroken string will become real. And this is a remarkable accomplishment, not just because the United States has been able to negotiate free trade agreements with all these countries, but because they've negotiated free trade agreements with themselves. In other words, this is a strategic accomplishment of all the countries along the Pacific coast, and it creates a strategic platform to launch across the Pacific into Asia and to have a completely different kind of conversation with Mercosur. And from my point of view, this is an integrating force in the region and a positive force. But also, this is a region that has been changing a lot. But I think some of the most important changes have been a fundamental commitment to the region, to leadership in the region by Canada, Mexico, and Brazil. And I believe that this commitment by the three countries, allied with the United States, creates a level of stability in the region, which is going to be important as it works through this difficult period of politics. And again, referring back to what Jim Colby said, this really is about communication between leaders and citizens. It really is communication between elites and those who are brand new to this democratic process. And it's also about communication among countries. And this should actually give us hope, because if there's one thing we can do, it's communicate. Politics is not war. Politics is communication. And I think that we really do have a huge opening for good leadership and good diplomacy, and I think this is the time to take advantage of it.
Well, thank you very much. You don't have to take this, but I have time for 2 short questions and 2 short answers if somebody wants to ask them. That's 1 and that's 2. Identify yourself, please. Thank you very much. Do you have a microphone? The microphone is coming.
I would like to ask...
who are you, excuse me?
Sorry. Ricardo Hausman from Harvard University. I'd like to ask Tom Shannon and Jim Colby, what do you think should be the U.S. reaction in case the Raul Reyes computer information turns out to be true? And how would you redesign or rethink about the Plan Colombia strategy to make it more effective if the information on that computer was right?
Well, who wants to begin with? Actually, it's a very easy question in just a couple of sentences.
Yeah, I do think Tom should answer this. This is something for the U.S. government. I'm no longer in the government, so I think Tom should answer that.
You have all the time.
I think it's a great opportunity for the Secretary General to illustrate us what kind of information he has is different to the collective information that we all.
Well, I'm the moderator of this session. I shouldn't say anything, but I will say just a word. My role is never to divide the Americas. As long as there's one possibility of avoiding the traumas of the 60s and the 70s, I I'll keep working in that, and I will not deviate from that line. So I hope that the situations that have been portrayed these last moments never happen. I don't know why some people are so eager to see somebody punished and somebody thrown out of the system. I always say something very simple. This is better to say it in English. And I'm not a fire. I'm not here to make fire. I'm here to put out the fires, and that's what I try to do. And maybe sometimes I may sound naive. Maybe somebody will want us to be stronger. But for me, the era of intervention in Latin America is over, and I hope it's over forever. And I am willing to be patient and to negotiate and to go from one side to the other, trying to get people together and work together, and never to advance judgments that may be divisive for the region. That's all I can have to say. Well, thank you very much for everybody, to everybody for being here. Thank you. Well, that's how you...
To even think that this is possible at this moment, but the fact that we're also having the CEO of the China Construction Bank, Mr. Guo, with us here today shows that Latin America has diversified. There is a lot of investments also from other parts of the world going to Latin America, so maybe one is not so dependent on the US as one was a decade ago. My first question goes to Mr. Rhodes. And it is about the US downturn. Sir, how much do you think, and what do you think the implications for Latin America will be on the US downturn?
I am not a believer in decoupling, but having said that, because I think we're more independent than ever, and we're sitting at an organization, a grouping that has pushed interdependency for many, many years, the World Economic Forum, and the openness of trade and investment worldwide. Having said that, I think Latin America has made tremendous strides over the last decade, and particularly over the last 5 or 6 years, in strengthening the economies of many countries, in the sense of the financial system, I think in institution building, in the area of trade, and I think also it has done a lot. I think a little more needs to be done in advancing technology, education, health. So I think it's a much different Latin America from, let's say, 10 years ago. Also, I think there's less reliance, although there's still, depending on the country, very, very important relationships on the trade side with the United States. But I think that Latin America is doing more, the countries of Latin America doing more among themselves in the sense of trade, and also more with Europe. And I think very importantly now, and I think Mr. Guo's presence here, as you said, is an indication of the interest of Asia, and I think that Latin America and the countries of Latin America have to do more, I think, with Asia. And one of the interesting things is a number of countries like Brazil are doing more with Africa, because we tend to forget about Africa, but these are areas that I think Africa and Asia that are really open to Latin America. And a number of major companies in Latin America are very active worldwide and are expanding in the areas that I've mentioned. One of the things that I haven't said before, but I think this is probably the opportune time to say it, is when we talk about free trade and the opportunity of trade and investment, I think we should not forget that in Miami 10 years ago, we had the heads of state get together and talk about a Latin American free trade agreement. And unfortunately, since then, not much has happened. It's kind of like the Doha round. And I think this is one of the things that needs to be talked about also going forward. But I think we're looking in many ways, in most of the countries in Latin America, as a new Latin America, and we have to understand this is not the Latin America of 10 years ago. So, yes, there will be an impact from the U.S. economy, and on the one hand, and obviously, when you have volatility in financial markets, that affects everybody in one way or the other. And so, and we've seen the volatility in exchange rates, the volatility also in the markets in general, and the stock markets in particular in a number of countries. So that's what you get with interdependence in some ways. But I'd like to say that I think Latin America has made some very important steps forward and has done so in most countries, not all, with democracy, and we shouldn't forget that either. Thank you.
With your experience also with the U.S. economy, do you think we are half through this financial crisis now?
Well, you know, I've said it at the press conference, you picked up on that I think we are half through. I like to say we're in the fifth inning for those of you who follow U.S. baseball, and I think that's kind of where we are, which is about halfway through. That's on, I think, the financial market situation to reestablish, I think, some calm there. But I think in the U.S. economy itself, we're entering into a recession, and that could last 2 or 3 quarters. So, and the U.S. housing problem is not going to be over anytime soon. If we're lucky, we'll see it bottom out by the end of this year, maybe not until the beginning of next year. So I think the U.S. economy is in for a rough period for the next few quarters, and the financial markets for a time longer, although there has been progress there recently.
Mr. Gabriele, the CEO of very successful Petrobras, looking at the picture now in the national economy, how are the prospects for Brazil in the coming year and your company?
I think that different from my friend Bill Rhodes here, I believe in the decoupling theory. And maybe the difference between us is more on the degree of decoupling and on the degree of the downturn in the U.S. economy. I think the Brazilian economy today has a very good position to show the decoupling of the Brazilian economy. It's true that if we have a long recession in the United States and deep recession in the United States, these would affect Brazil. There's no doubt on that. But if we have a short and mild recession in the United States, I think the impacts on Brazil are very small. We have right now, we don't have, as we had in the last 30 years, a foreign exchange problem. Our balance of payment is surplus. We have a lot of foreign reserves. We have an appreciation of real even stronger than some would like. And we don't have, in the face of a foreign exchange area, we don't have big problems. Internally, we have certain problems in the fiscal budget, but we are solving these with the growth. And we have a very big and a very large growth perspective coming from the domestic market. The inclusion of millions of Brazilians to the economy is booming areas that are really growing almost as fast as China. If you look at small cities in the northeast of Brazil, for example, they are growing faster than China right now. And the domestic market is very much a main driving force of the Brazilian economy right now. On the external area, our relation to the United States of America, we sell less than 25% of our total exports to the United States. We sell more to South America now than to the United States of America. We sell more to South America and Africa and Asia than we sell to the United States and Europe together right now. which means that we have different trade partners right now. Not only we have several regional differentiation, but also we could arrange a differentiated structure of exports. We export several types of different goods. We export commodities and non-commodities. We export manufacturing goods and non-manufacturing goods. We even export, we are even net export of oil right now. On the financial side, however, we have impacts. For sure, if you have a crisis that is going to reduce liquidity, and for sure for Brazilian companies to raise resources in the financial market is more difficult, and then we have to find other sources of alternatives for financing very good projects that we have. Which means that in the short run, I think in the 2 quarters that we have ahead of us, we have not big problems to face. Even inflation is under control. Even inflation, we have a very high rate of interest, but inflation is coming much more from the cost side than from the demand side, on my view. I don't know if every Brazilian economist would agree with me, but I think we have more cost pressure than cost push inflation than demand-driven inflation in Brazil right now. But I think that if the American economy goes deep in recession, this would have a trickling down impact on Brazil. And as such, I believe that we are following a decoupling path right now.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting, because 10 years ago, as you were saying yourself, it wouldn't be possible to have such a decoupling because we're much more relying on the U.S. economy. But if I understand you rightly, it's possible to continue with quite robust growth in Brazil, but even with a downturn in the U.S. economy. But if at the top of that you had a downturn, also much lower economic growth in China, then it would be really difficult. But looking at Latin America has been doing substantially much better the 5 years than for many years. But still, the economic growth in Latin America has been lower than in Asia and even lower than in Africa. What are the main obstacles for even strengthening the growth in the years to come? What are the structural changes that has to take place to do as well as Asia, in your point of view? Mr. Gabrielli. Still you?
I think that we have several things that are different. I think, for example, in China and India, we are having rural-urban movement that Brazil had in the 1930s. The inclusion of a lot of people in urban life that China is living right now makes possible to have a very high rate of growth only as a result of this inclusion. Brazil had this process in the 30s and 40s, which means that we don't have the same type of growth right now. If you look at different areas in Brazil, for example, where we are having right now there's a movement from the rural areas to urban areas, we are going to see that we also have a very large rate of growth in those areas. Second, we face probably a larger infrastructure bottleneck than China has right now. We face difficulties in our ports, in our roads, in the energy sector. We have a lot of bottlenecks that we have that we must attract investment. We are coming out of 30 years of non-growth perspective in Brazil. 30 years. For 30 years, we almost didn't grow in Brazil. We have stabilization problems, and we have to face short-run problems. We didn't have any stimulus, real stimulus for growth in Brazil, which means that I think there are main difference. The institutional building process, I think that's not big difference between China and Brazil. I think both countries are developing new institutions, and both countries have possibilities to create a good environment for investment.
I also think the presence of the CEO of China Construction Bank, Mr. Guo here, shows the real keen interest in China now for involving itself more even in Latin America. Already there has been a lot of investments from China to Latin America, but still less to Latin America than to Africa. So Mr. Guo, what can Latin America do to even be more attractive for Chinese investments to enhance the already planned investments from the Latin American actors themselves?
Thank you very much. I think Latin America already become very attractive to China's investors because we got a big problem with the food and energy and raw materials, especially the iron ore and copper prices increased dramatically in recent days. And we now last year is the largest producer of the steel. That is something like 500 million ton. In the past time, the Soviet Union and the U.S., the big producer in the steel, but just above 100 million ton. But now China is more than 500 million tons. So yes, like that gentleman mentioned, from the Brazil, China is under the process of the urbanization and the industrialization, and also we call the information process together. So in the past 30 years, we had above 9.7 or 9.8, average growth rate in GDP. So that's very, very important to the Latin America, to China's economy. And what we are faced the challenges, I think partly we can solve here. That's through the win-win solution. So I think the Chinese government and the companies and the individuals really interested in investing in Latin America. We still concern very much about environment for the investments. To be frank, we hope that it's a benign and transparent environment and investment-friendly environment. I know the country here is different, from the countries. Like Mexico is very relatively very open, but other countries maybe not. But anyway, I think that it's the most important thing for these countries. Now we were talking about the recession and the U.S.'s negative impact on the Latin American economy. But I think just we can take this opportunity to change the structure. If your export not 50% rely on the U.S. economy, diversified to the Asian and China and Japan and other, including European and Africa. That must be much better. I think that's some very important things. Actually, Latin America in the past time, the past twice globalization in the 15th century and 19th century, is very globalized. You produce a lot of, let's say, the corn and the potato and the chili and the tobacco. That's made a very big change in China's economy and other countries' economy. So you can be much more globalized. So here I got some proposal. Is the first you should open your economy in general, the region wider, and because all developed economies and fast growing undeveloped economies is open to the open door policy very thoroughly. Secondly, it should be opened more overly, including not only the agriculture and basic, manufacturers, but also including the heavy industries, infrastructures, even the financial services. That's very important, I think.
Just shortly, when we are potentially seeing a recession in the U.S., everyone looks at China as an engine of growth. Could you please share with us your thoughts about where do you think the growth will end in China this year and the coming years. So we should just, know what to expect, because a lot of us rely now on the Chinese engine.
Yes, we are actually what we are worried about, just the opposite. In China we got very much about overheating, because the newly released figure about last year's growth rate is 11.7. The first season figures I haven't seen before I left China, but I guess it's still above 10% or something like that. So the whole year, I think, still around 10. And I personally hope that should be a slowdown a little bit, like to the 9% or something like that. But still is a very strong engine. I think China has really played a big role in the economic, development in the whole world, because we import a lot. This year, the first 3 months is the increase of the import actually is faster than the export from everywhere in the Latin America, Australia, and also Europe, and also from the U.S. The increase is very, very dramatically.
Thank you. Even with the 9% economic growth in China, that would mean quite a demand on the overall global economy. Turning over to Mr. Bayeres, seeing also the initiatives that President Calderon has presented lately on structural changes in Mexico. It's the tax reform, it's the reform of the energy sector, seeing also reform connected to the pensions. Do you think we're now seeing a more robust and more competitive Mexican economy? And what are the next reforms that you think is necessary for Mexico to introduce?
Thank you. Well, the short answer is yes. There's no doubt we're seeing a much more robust Mexico. And the reason for that is, as you mentioned, is what has happened lately. I believe that the growth that we're seeing in Mexico will definitely be affected by whatever happens in the U.S. economy, like it will in every part of the world. Now, what's happening in Mexico is the coincidences that we're living today are much different than in the past. As of today, without any more reforms, the government has the tax reform that obviously bringing much more income to the government. The prices of oil are also helping to bring much more income to the government. And because of that, as President Calderon has mentioned, Mexico will have the possibility to jumpstart the economy through government actions for about $50 billion a year. He was just mentioning that the Canal de Panama is going to have a cost of $5 billion, and Mexico, fortunately, is going to be able to spend $50 billion a year. So that in itself is a different story. The peso and the dollar devaluation in relationship to the yen and the euro has also helped Mexico for having better trade circumstances with Europe and our partners in Latin America. And besides that, with everything that's happening both in Europe and in the U.S., Mexico is receiving much more investment than it was planned. And that's already happening today with the reforms that have happened. The President just passed a proposal for a reform on energy, which the only thing that is not acceptable in that circumstances is the fact that you don't want dialogue. But I think it's a very good step, and all the reforms that has happened in Mexico as of today are not and have not been intended to be the reforms, but have intended to be the reforms that are possible today to take the first step towards a much better Mexico. Now, the following reforms, to answer the second part of your question, that I believe are needed in Mexico are the labor reform, so that we have a more flexible labor force, more flexible laws in order to move as fast as our competitors. Also, education. I think we need a much better education, an education where we can not only have extended education all over Mexico, but where we have a better quality of education, as well as the health reform. Basically, what I believe Mexico needs and all of our countries is to take advantage of this economic situation, which is obviously going to bring challenges, but also great opportunities. Basically, what we need is a performance transformation. We need to transform the way we perform. We need to transform the labor laws. We need to transform the bureaucratic processes to be more agile. We need to transform, obviously, the health system. And I think it's a great opportunity for us to learn to depend less on economies like the U.S. As you were mentioning, obviously, the dependency on the U.S., it depends on, in Latin America, it depends. I mean, the more up north you are, the more dependent you are on that economy. But we've been working on that, and I believe that's the circumstances that we're living today. And the most important factor, and I think it's important for all of us, is what can we do, the people in this room and many other people, to help in that, to help the president on what he's doing, and to help the different countries in Latin America, and that's leadership. I think that what we need is we need to take advantage of this opportunity that we're living in our countries to push people and to push governments into these changes, into these positions that can transform the way we perform as companies, as individuals, and obviously as countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fernandez, you have also followed very closely the development in Mexico and Latin America. You heard this discussion earlier on. There is nuances between the two gentlemen on my right-hand side, if it's possible to decouple what we're seeing now in the development of the U.S. economy and the Latin American economy.
Yes.
What is your position on that? The first question. The other one, what are the reforms that you think Latin America should go through and initiate now to be even more competitive in the years to come?
Well, I tend to believe that we can not depend that much from the U.S. economy, and that we should be able to be open to any operation and any economic relation with Europe, for instance, where we are lacking of better relations with them, and with Asia, where we could help China to transform products and send them to U.S., or the way around, we could export to China products also. My main thought about the challenges that we have in Latin America, and I tend to see all of them more like if you see a company or an enterprise, is that first of all we should look for investment attraction with much more added value than the ones that we have today. I think we have a lot of a huge economy that is dedicated to transform raw materials or produce raw materials, and we should look for much more innovative, technological, and service-oriented community where we could really develop much more strategic benefits for the region. I think we can develop very much in tourism, we can develop a lot in health services, we can develop in financial services, and we can do a lot of IT processes also, for instance. Another big problem that we have is infrastructure. I think we should promote integration in the region, and one very important way is to find the way of creating some kind of multilateral fund that could be dedicated from all of the countries in Latin America, that should be dedicated to create infrastructure in Latin America, to create ports, highways, to have much better digital technology for all of us. Another big important challenge that we have is how to cope with rule of law, how to really become a complete legal society, the whole community, the whole region. That is a very important thing. We should promote transparency, we should fight corruption,
And we should lead this pressure to the government and to all the society on rule of law. Lastly, and it's obvious that everybody mentions this, but I think there should be a detailed form on promoting education. But not only education, that we try to have more graduate people only. We should focus our education. We should look for very important aligned education with the type of preparation that our people need for the services or for the technological orientation that we need. We don't have in our education basic skills for our kids sometimes. Team working, the research power. Our kids don't investigate, don't make research, and that is very important for the future. Another thing that we should develop in education, we should try to look for technological centers or clusters investigation and research centers where we could look for certain products or certain patents that could be aligned with the benefits or the needs of the certain region. For instance, we know that in Mexico we are developing now patents to do research on cancer, for instance, with Mexican food products that could be developed to produce medicines that can help us to combat cancer. Well, nobody would ever have thought of this possibility in Mexico. It's doable. What we see that the Brazilians, our friends from Brazil, have been able to do in aerospace, in oil, in such a short period of time. That means it's another possibility, and I'm sure that you can find examples everywhere in Latin America. The logistics technology that Colombia has to put beautiful flowers in US in 1 day or 2 days from Colombia to US, that's another technological advantage. It's a process, it's not a product, it's a service. But that means there are things that can be done if we really invest in technological research.
Mr. Rhodes, listening to all these ideas and all these initiatives that are taken for also on structural changes so far, are they sufficient, and are you thinking of someone in addition?
Well, I think that, as I said earlier, I think there's been tremendous progress in so many areas in Latin America, but I think some of the points my Mexican friends were mentioning there, I think are important and need to be worked on, which are education. And I think particularly when you look at what's going on in Asia, I think the area of education, technology, and you can never do enough on healthcare, as being mentioned here, I think are all very, very important. And institution building never ends. So I think these are all areas which need to be worked on. Diversification of trade, very, very important. I think everyone around the panel here has mentioned that. And I think we are in a global world, and I think trade patterns going forward will change, and I think it's very, very important. I think on the technology side, we've mentioned Embraer, and we've mentioned Petrobras, and there are other cases where you see the technology exists here. And I think that more needs to be done in that area. So I think that it's kind of a brave new world out there, and Latin America should be very much in the forefront, and I think it can be. And again, when I look at the people at here at the panel, I think the private sector must play a very dominant role here. The state has the role of the state, but if there's not a private sector, both of my Mexican friends have mentioned this, driving these things, they won't happen. So I think the role of the private sector is key in all the initiatives that we're talking about here.
Excellent. Mr. Gabriele, in a decade, Petrobras has developed into one of the world-leading or the world-leading company when it comes to operating in deep sea. How did you achieve this from Rio de Janeiro and Brazil? And is there a lesson to be learned on this for the rest of Latin America?
Each country, each company has its own history. Petrobras achieved what we are now, not in 10 years, but much more than that. We start our offshore production in the 80s, the beginning of the 80s, because we didn't have oil. Petrobras began producing 2.5 thousand barrels a day. Today we produce 2.3 million barrels a day. And we had to find oil, and the way to do that was to explore, to find where we can find it. And we decided, we took risks, and it was very difficult at the first moment to have a program to go to 300 meters of water depth. At that time we were pioneers. We tried to get all the expertise. Almost 100% of our technician people are Brazilians, Brazilian technicians, and we, together with the best company in each part, for each part of the technology, we try to get the best companies to associate with us, and as such we could incorporate each particular knowledge and get this overall combination of different knowledges, and took risks. And finally we could get these beautiful discoveries in the pre-salt area, but we have to take risks to see if one well, the first well for the pre-salt area costs $240 million and could be dry and would lose $240 million. And we have to have a very good risk assessment project. We have to know and be very confident that we know what we are going to do.
Excellent. Is there any questions in the audience? We can have one before we close.
Very well said.
Is there anyone? Okay. My last question goes then to Baleares. Listening to this oil story from Brazil, do you think there is anything of the experience of Petrobras that does apply also for Mexico, where we know that 40% of the revenues in Mexico comes currently from the oil and gas sector?
Yeah, I think there's two things. The first one is that we need to, as we're doing, we need to develop the country much more in all different areas so that we don't depend that much on oil, which today obviously we have 40% because due to the price of oil, but it was lower before. Now, definitely there is a lot of experiences that we can bring from Petrobras. The group that I represent also is in the mining sector, and with all natural resources, as you said, I mean, the rule number one is you need to explore. Without that, you don't have a company. But the great thing that I see happening in Mexico is that most people in the country are willing to give Pemex the circumstance, the governance, which is a very important step, so that those type of things can be done and can be regulated and can be watched by the Mexican citizens. And it's right now we're in the process of living that. So I think we're in the right track.
Thank you very much. I think everyone is sitting here with the clear impression that even if we see a downturn in the US economy, there is still a lot of optimism in Latin America. There is still a lot of optimism in China that is still enjoying quite substantial economic growth. And if one has good business, there is a lot of business opportunities too for those that are creative and innovative and are willing to go through the structural changes. So this sends a strong message also to the business community. There is not a gloomy picture for Latin America. It's a Latin America that is also going to have quite substantial economic growth in the years to come, and Latin America that are diversifying. That is a great message to bring with us for tomorrow. Thank you very much to the panel. Thank you very much for your patience.